to run with this chick that was a little unstable, to say the least. She'd probably kill me if she heard what I was about to say using her real name, so for my own sake, I'm going to refer to her as Jane. To make a long backstory short, she came from a messed up family, and her dad was sort of at the center of a lot of her problems. When he finally died, she told me she went to the funeral just so she could find out where he was buried. A few days later, in the middle of the night, Jane called to ask me to take her to the cemetery to smash his gravestone. Although that was something I would never do to anyone, no matter how much I hated them, I could understand why Jane would want to do something like that against her father's memory. She didn't have a license, so I picked her up and we drove to the cemetery. When I parked the car in the visitor lot outside, she pulled a hammer and a handful of grocery bags out of her purse. She said she just wanted to go in, smash it up into a bunch of small pieces, bag it up, and leave. Obviously, I knew that we were breaking at least one law by trespassing into the cemetery after dark, but this was alright with me, and I just told her I would keep an eye out for anyone in the area while she did what she needed to do. On that note, we got out and we hurried over to the grave. Jane knew exactly where it was, so it took us no time at all. But I was still extremely nervous about the whole thing. It wasn't just the threat of being arrested, but the vibe of the cemetery itself. It really felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like we were disturbing all those dead people by marching through in the middle of the night. I kept my head on straight and I tried to give Jane space. At first, she spent a minute kneeling on top of the relatively fresh grave, whispering a bunch of curses and crying, just from the sheer intensity of whatever emotion she was feeling. But then, without warning, she started screaming. She started striking the headstone for the first time. It caught me so off guard that it sent chills through my whole body. I spun around and I was about to tell her to quiet down, but at first glance, I knew she wasn't going to hear me. She was going absolutely berserk on this stone, screaming and wailing at the top of her lungs. Each time she hit it with the hammer, only a small piece would break off. I realized we were going to be there for a while if it went on at this pace, and she was making so much god-awful noise that I was terrified that somebody in the nearby neighborhood would hear us. I also thought about how blood-curdling it would feel to be walking by the graveyard and hear Jane's banshee-like shrieking in the distance, and to be unsure if she was like a ghost or a serial killer or something. My instincts set in, and I became more concerned about my own safety than anything else. Here was this completely unhinged crazy person, violently thrashing their way through a mixture of grief and unhealed trauma, seeing red with total tunnel vision, and I was alone with her, surrounded by darkness and dead people. I was worried that if I got near her, she would forget it was me and think I was the ghost of her father and start trying to kill me or something, so I backed away. However, it wasn't long before the deep-seated rage within Jane started to wear off a bit and she became tired. She then stopped and she looked at the progress that she made. 2/3 of the headstone was still intact, but she was already exhausted. That's when she looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw the look of unveiled insanity in Jane's eyes. I'd always known Jane had a few screws loose, but this was next level crazy. All her movements were sudden and jarring. She stood and shoved the hammer into my chest, telling me to take it and finish the job. I protested at first, not wanting to get roped further into what I thought was Jane's thing she needed to do. But as soon as I did, she grabbed me by the ears and yanked my head down so that my face was less than an inch away from hers. She then screamed so loud that it practically ruptured my eardrums. She demanded that I break the gravestone for her, or she'd use the hammer on me and bury my body next to her father's. Seeing that I was in too deep to back out, I reluctantly accepted the task and committed myself to making short work of it. Of course, I was stronger than Jane, but I wasn't nearly as uninhibited. What happened next, though, made me all the more sure that I shouldn't have tried to fight her or anything. As I was hacking away at the stone, managing to break off bigger pieces, she was standing behind me, laughing like an absolute maniac. She was cheering me on the way I imagined a witch would encourage another witch to their first human sacrifice. I tried my best to ignore her, but it was impossible. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she pulled out a knife, which sent another chill down my spine. Before I knew it, she knelt behind me and straddled my back, throwing her arms over my shoulders, whispering literal pure evil into my ears. I froze up and stopped swinging the hammer because I didn't want to hit her. She told me I was almost done, then she did something I'll never forget. Both of her hands were out in front of me, one of which held the knife. Right before my eyes, she put the blade to her palm and sliced it open, creating a fountain of blood which quickly spilled down her wrist. Then she whispered some kind of satanic blessing in tongues and smeared her bloody hand over my face, from my forehead down to my chin, then across my throat, until she finally rested her hand with a vice grip at the base of my neck. She asked me if I could taste the blood, and I said I could. She took pleasure in this, and then she finally let go of me to stand on the grave again. Then she screamed out at the top of her lungs that these would be the final tears she would ever cry over her father. As she looked up into the night sky with her eyes open, she put her hand up to the moon and clenched her fist, squeezing the wound to form drops of blood which fell down upon her eyes and face. I watched this whole thing, stunned out of my mind, until she looked back at me with her face full of bloody tears and growled at me to finish the job. Of course, I was thoroughly terrified of Jane by this point and I was ready to leave. But I just did as she said. At last, when the whole thing was smashed to bits, I convinced Jane that we needed to go. Thankfully, she seemed ready, but the entire time we were picking up the pieces and bagging them, she was giggling. When it was all cleaned up, we ran back to my car, somehow going through this whole entire ordeal without anyone seeing or calling the cops on us. I drove Jane back home and I dropped her off. As she got out of my car, she tried to drag me out to spend the night with her. I'd been waiting for that night for months, but by then, I knew where that would go, and I knew it would be no good for me, so I made up some excuse about having to work the next day. In the morning, I cut off all contact, and I've been avoiding her out of fear ever since. I'll never forget when I worked nighttime security at a cemetery for about 2 weeks. It was never something I wanted to do as a security guard, but I didn't have a choice. The agency I worked for forced me to transfer due to an incident where I allegedly assaulted a kid who happened to have rich parents while doing my job. I'm not allowed to talk about that case though, so I won't. I didn't want to work at a cemetery for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, my boss told me to accept the transfer or resign from the agency, and I wasn't ready to be out of a job. The cemetery in question was the oldest in the city and it was considered historic. However, it just signed a contract for nighttime security after a couple of grave robberies that had recently occurred. It only happened twice in recent history, but in the span of a couple weeks, which indicated that it might happen again. Aside from the daytime toll booth workers, I was the first security guard to work there, which meant I had nobody before me to tell me how things might go. I couldn't sit still the first night, so I made a lot of walkabouts through the burial grounds in an effort to desensitize myself from how damn spooky it was in the dark. It had the opposite effect, though. At one point, I came across one of the graves that had been robbed. It was already refilled, although the grass hadn't been recovered yet. The marker was eroded, but I could tell that it was a woman who had lived to be pretty old. I paid my respects and I walked on without thinking much of it. Over the course of a few nights, nothing happened. It was one of the more boring starts to a job that I've had. I was used to getting off work around 4 or 5 a.m. at the latest, but I was in the graveyard from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. 3 nights a week, and that schedule didn't suit me. I became extremely drowsy halfway through each shift, and the coffee available in the booth was like water to me. When I went back for my second round of shifts, I was already over it. There was nobody around to notice though, so I didn't care. I was through with my first week, so I figured my supervisors would be more lax about watching over the camera footage. Instead of trying to force myself to stay awake when I was exhausted and nothing was happening, I let myself sleep when I felt like it. I didn't think the grave robbers would actually come back and try their luck for a third time once they knew I was there. And it's not like I had a problem stealing company time from the agency that screwed me over. However, there was one party who had a problem with me sleeping on the job. The last night I worked there, I was exhausted from the previous shifts, and it didn't take too long for me to start dozing off in my chair. I actually fell into a deep enough sleep to start dreaming. I don't remember how the dream started, but I know that at some point it suddenly became a nightmare. I had laid down thinking I was about to get a massage or something, only to feel an immense pain in my stomach. I screamed and I opened my eyes to see a gaunt elderly woman standing above me with a shovel, plunging it into my abdomen and digging out my insides. I couldn't move, and all I could do was watch her eviscerate me. It was the most vivid dream that I've ever had. Luckily, I was able to force myself awake. I opened my eyes with a start. Then, right there on the other side of the booth window, I saw that same decrepit old woman staring right at me. I jumped back and I fell off the chair, losing sight of her for a second. When I got to my feet, she was gone, but I was thoroughly shaken. I was terrified by the thought of going out there, but I knew it was my job to go looking for anyone who attempted to trespass, and to be honest, I didn't feel any safer being a sitting duck in the toll booth. I stepped outside into the cold, under a full moon, and turned on my flashlight, throwing the beam in every direction. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then my heart skipped a beat when I saw a figure standing near the back of the property by the trees. I shouted at them, but they didn't respond. I had to look away for a second as I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, but it was thankfully just a possum that I startled into running off. That was logical and reassuring, although there was still that mysterious figure standing by the woods. But of course, when I looked back, she was gone. I couldn't understand how such a frail old woman was covering so much ground. But I marched over to where I last saw her without thinking about it. I had to walk across the entire graveyard to get to the back of the property. Along the way, it seemed like every single creature in the woods was going insane. I heard flocks of birds suddenly take flight from all the trees at once, right as an owl let out one of those awful screeches that they make. Even a pack of coyotes started to go haywire in the distance. I felt like all the forces in nature were warning me not to keep going, but in my gut, I was worried that if I stopped walking that something else would happen. So I pressed on until I finally got to the edge of the graveyard. I looked around with a flashlight and called out to the person I saw, but I didn't see or hear anyone. Then, as quickly as it all had started, all the noises in the woods stopped. Every single animal fell silent. Even the bugs went quiet. I muttered to myself in confusion and I started to turn around, but that's when I noticed I was standing right on top of one of the graves that had been robbed, the one of the old woman that I'd seen the week before. As soon as I realized this, I felt stiff hands wrap around my throat and my feet were kicked out from under me. I couldn't see who was doing this to me, but they were strong as hell. They bashed my face into the recently replaced dirt probably a dozen times, until it started to feel like I was about to pass out from lack of oxygen. Then at the last second, it stopped. I felt the rough touch of the hand simply disappear. I quickly got to my feet in a panic, but I couldn't see anyone in the area. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, but there was no way that I could have. It felt as real as anything else. Whatever it was had me chilled to the bone. I didn't finish my shift that night. I ran to my car with my tail between my legs and I quit the job on the spot. This event has haunted me ever since. I've pieced together what it meant over the years. The spirit of the old woman who was robbed didn't take kindly to me slacking on the job, and she took matters into her own hands to make sure it never happened again. I've never been a superstitious person, but sometimes things happen in life that make you reevaluate your assumptions. Even now, when I'm at work and I feel myself getting the urge to slack off, I see that woman out of the corner of my eye for a split second, reminding me of the lesson she taught me. I've never told this story to anyone. I know I shouldn't even do so anonymously at the risk of being connected to it, but it's been eating at me for decades. It happened when I was a kid. I was about 13 years old and it was the night of Halloween. I lived in a relatively new suburb at the time, which had been built to increase the number of homes in the small town that was growing adjacent to the freeway. It all looks very different now, but back then, the area wasn't nearly as developed. Strangely, nowhere was this more obvious than the cemetery that was a few turns off the main road in what used to be the outskirts. At the time, it was mostly vacant, as not enough people had died to fill it up yet. That would change, however, as me and my two friends, who I'll protect by calling Aaron and Michael, decided we wanted to go exploring the empty graveyard instead of trick-or-treating. We knew it would get us in trouble, so we put in some effort to cover our tracks. We wore costumes and started the night by immediately stealing a few bowls of candy that were set out and mixed in all together, so it would look as though we actually went trick-or-treating, like our parents thought. Then we walked about a mile off the beaten path so we could get to the cemetery without being seen by the cars in the main road. This involved hopping a fence that surrounded a large drainage pond for the freeway and cutting across the banks to hop the fence again into the cemetery grounds. As we got off the residential streets, we were bathed in darkness, which meant there was almost no chance that we would be seen. We thought we were safe, but what we didn't know was that we were being followed. Once we had successfully snuck in, we stomped around and tried to scare each other for laughs. Then we found a few blank gravestones laying around next to a crypt, and we smashed them together just because we could. We took a few chunks as souvenirs. There wasn't much else for us to get up to, though. The whole place was eerily empty. We were used to seeing them filled to the brim with gravestones, but the majority of this space was just uninterrupted grass. Eventually, we got bored, but we weren't ready to leave, so we sat down against the backs of a few gravestones to avoid sitting on top of dead people. There was a view of the freeway that looked pretty cool, since it was the only thing that was lit up for miles. For a moment, we were just sitting there being kids. Then it all came crashing down as we heard what sounded like a person behind us. We all jumped in fright, and we turned around, but we couldn't see anything. Just gravestones. The ghastly wailing continued, and then it started to say our names. We shouted at it, trying to claim we weren't scared of it, but we were. We thought we were totally alone, so maybe it was a ghost that was mad at us for being there when we were supposed to. We started walking towards it with small terrified steps, hoping we would look behind one of the gravestones and see a person messing with us. All three of us were clutching broken chunks of granite, as if it would help defend us from the supernatural. When we started getting closer, it seemed like we were localizing the source of the noise. That's when it said something that I wished it wouldn't have every single day. For context, my friend Aaron's mother was extremely ill with cancer at the time. That's part of the reason that we were acting out by breaking into the cemetery in the first place. He was in a funk and he was mad at the world, and he was our friend that we did stuff with. Understandably, Aaron stopped in his tracks when the voice claimed that it was the ghost of his mother. I can't imagine what was going on through his head. A lot of powerful mixed emotions that must have been a lot for a 13-year-old to handle. He shouted back, trying to cast doubt, but he was already choking up. The supposed ghost of his mother dug deeper, saying that she just died a few minutes ago. Aaron said that was a lie, but the voice didn't care. It started to cry and say that because he wasn't in the neighborhood like a good boy, his father wasn't able to find him, and she died wondering where her son was and why he didn't love her enough to be there. Aaron yelled again that it wasn't true, that it couldn't be, but it struck him so badly he was failing to hold back his tears. Michael and I started trying our best to console him, not really knowing how. But then the mood changed on a dime when the unknown voice stopped crying and started laughing. Then, it didn't sound like the ghost of a woman anymore, but a snickering boy. We looked over and saw someone crawling out of their hiding spot behind a gravestone. It was somebody we knew, but I can't say his name. He was a couple years older than us, and he was the neighborhood bully. He must have seen us sneaking off and followed us so he could pull some kind of prank like this for kicks. All of Aaron's sadness turned into anger in an instant as he charged toward the bully, who was laughing so hard he didn't notice how pissed off Aaron was. Nobody expected him to do what he did next. Aaron tackled the boy to the ground and started beating on him, screaming furiously that it was way too far to joke about someone's sick mother dying. Michael and I agreed, and we hated being bullied by this kid too, so we let it happen, figuring it would teach the jerk a lesson. Unfortunately, we didn't notice before it was too late that Aaron wasn't just pounding the kid in the face with his fists, but with the chunk of gravestone he'd broken off a few minutes prior. After just a few more seconds, there was no sound or movement from the bully, no indication at all that he was still fighting back. Michael and I exchanged a worried look right before deciding that this in fact was going too far and we needed to stop it. We rushed over to Aaron and pulled him off the bully. As we held him back, we looked down at the other kid and saw just how badly he'd been beaten. The jagged stone had turned his face into an unrecognizable bloody mess. There were deep gashes all over his face and head. Even in the darkness, we knew, but we still waited for him to get up, or to at least groan in pain, but he never did. Gradually, Aaron let go of his rage and he came to realize what he had done. Michael and I were already stunned. He broke away from us, but then he rushed back in a panic, trying to wake the kid up by shaking and yelling his name, but none of it was any good. He finally looked back at us, and he asked us to say that he was just unconscious and not dead. Only one of us knew how to check. I could see that Michael was shaking as he stepped to the body and knelt down, checking for a pulse. He checked and waited, even bringing his ear down to his face to check for breathing, but unfortunately, he only confirmed the worst. Aaron had killed our neighborhood bully. After an internal silence, Aaron snapped us out of our daze. He took charge of the moment and he led us through the cover-up. We all thought about just coming clean, but we were so afraid of the repercussions. Well, Aaron was, and there was a small sick part of us that was glad that it happened, to be honest. The bully got what he deserved, to a certain extent. We did our best to think so anyways. Besides, we had no idea how to act in a situation like that, so we just listened to the orders that we heard. We dragged the body to the fence around the drainage pond and ripped the bottom of the chain link fence out of the dirt so we could pull the body under to the other side. Then we got a gravestone and a bunch of broken chunks and threw them over, including the ones we thought we were going to be souvenirs for the night. We took off his shoes and his jeans, then slid a gravestone underneath his shirt, fastening it to his chest by tying his jeans around his torso. Then we tied his shoes to his ankles and we filled them with stones. Aaron then dragged the body into the pond, and he was holding it up until he was neck deep. Then he pushed it towards the center and let go. We watched it sink as Aaron turned around and came out of the water, looking like a completely different person. Aaron's clothes needed to dry at least a little bit so we didn't look obviously drenched before we went back to the neighborhood. And we needed to make sure that the body wouldn't immediately float to the surface, so after throwing everything related to the killing in the pond and washing our hands of the blood, we hopped the fence and sat on the banks for a while where we couldn't be seen. It was totally silent the entire time. The bloodstains had been rinsed out of his clothes, but we would never be able to look at Aaron without seeing them. It was on our hands now too, and we had to live with that. It was hard to pretend to be a normal kid after that twisted coming of age moment. The disappearance was a talk of the town for days, even weeks, until the body finally floated to the surface a few weeks later and the murder was discovered. Nobody ever suspected us, but the publicity of the case going unsolved was torturous for us all, and the worst for Aaron. Michael and I were able to get back to a semblance of normal after a couple of years, but Aaron was never the same. When his mother finally died, he never talked to us again, and he never made any other friends. He kind of became the town degenerate, and nobody but Michael and I knew the real reason why. When he was 17, he ran away from home, and he's never been seen or heard from since.